Welcome to Murder, Mayhem, and Malice Intent, the podcast where I'll take you deep into the minds of history's most dangerous serial killers by exploring their methodology, victimology, and psychopathy. My name is Franklin James, the serial author, and I want to talk to you all about someone who's no longer amongst the living. He was probably one of the coldest, sexually motivated, sadomasochistic serial killers that ever walked this earth. I mean, he's left a number of cold cases and mayhem in his wake. So who is this monster I'm speaking of? Well, he's a game show killer himself, Rodney Alcala. Now, if you are familiar with Rodney Alcala, then you know about the horrible shit he's done. I mean, things that are just unimaginable. But if you aren't too familiar with him, I am going to do an overview of his life leading to his arrest and ultimately his death. Now let's get into it. All right, so Rodney Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas on August 23rd, 1943. And we don't know too much about his life before the age of 8 years old. We don't know what took place or what was happening. But from what I gathered, he appeared to be an ordinary kid, or at least he didn't exhibit any behavior which would indicate him becoming a serial killer down the line. Now, back then, they used metrics like fire setting, bedwetting, and animal cruelty as indicators of sociopathy. But, we now know it's much more complex than that. Although I feel like there's something there with the animal cruelty aspect. It tends to be a pretty common thing when it comes to serial killers. But like I said before, Rodney Alcala didn't exhibit any of those signs of sociopathy, at least not that we know of. However, we do know when he was 8 years old, his life completely changed overnight when his dad moved him and his family to Mexico. Now, this was back in 1951. And they moved because his grandmother was ill and she wanted to die there. Now, they're in Mexico for 3 years before we learn anything new about Rodney Alcala. It's 1954. He's 11 years old. And like I said, we have no idea what happened within that time frame. Although I question whether something significant took place in his life, something traumatic. Similar to how his father completely leaves his entire family in Mexico and moves back to the US. He completely abandoned them. Now, allegedly, it was because of work, but I feel as though there may have been more there. There may have been more to that story. In any event, I feel as though that particular action had a profound impact on Rodney Alcala. I mean, being abandoned by a parent puts an incredible amount of fear, uncertainty, and guilt on a child. Hell, it's difficult for an adult to handle that kind of turmoil, let alone a kid. Children can't rationalize traumatic events, so it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that Rodney Alcala developed abandonment issues due to that rejection. And because of that, he chose to live a life where he would never have to feel that again. A life where he was always in control. A life where he, dictated when things began and when things ended. Now, shortly after his father abandons his entire family, and I use that word because there's no mention of them reconnecting. Rodney Alcala, his mother, and his siblings, they all moved to the US to a suburb in California for a fresh start. Rodney Alcala is about 12 years old at the time. Essentially, his mom wanted a fresh start. She wanted a normal life. And from what I gathered, it was normal. Or at least it seemed pretty normal. Rodney Alcala was a gifted student intellectually and attended private schools. He was sociable, he was popular, he was athletic. On the surface, he was a typical teenager. In fact, in 1961, he graduated high school. He was 17 years old at the time. He then decides to enlist in the Army, where he was a paratrooper and served as a clerk, although it didn't take much time for him to start getting into trouble. Now, according to his commanding officer, Rodney Alcala was vindictive, manipulative, and insubordinate. He was also disciplined numerous times for assaulting women. I feel as though his fantasies about offending may have begun to take shape in his mind around that time. I mean, I can draw that conclusion just from him being disciplined for his actions for assaulting women. Now, ultimately, he gets medically discharged 3 years later in 1964 because he had a nervous breakdown after hearing about the death of his father. In his mind, he may have felt as though that his father was abandoning him once again, much like when he was a kid, but now it's permanent. So he's having an even harder time trying to process that trauma, trying to process the loss of his father. which I believe led to that nervous breakdown, right? That mental crisis. I think the death of his father definitely awakened something within him and put him on the path that he went on. And I'm not trying to justify his actions by any means. Rodney Alcala was a monster and he did some horrible shit. But it reminds me of a quote from the Joker in The Dark Knight where he said,
"See, madness, as you know, is like gravity. All it takes is a little push."
Now, while he's being discharged, he was diagnosed with anti-personality disorder. This is when one shows no regard for right and wrong and ignores the rights and feelings of others. They feel no guilt or remorse for their actions. So it's evident in 1964 that Rodney Alcala was displaying signs of psychopathy. And it's eerie to think about too. You know, I can't begin to imagine the things that he was doing in that time frame back in 1964, especially with a proclivity toward harassing women. But what I do know is that he decided to enroll in California State University and then transfer to UCLA once he was discharged. So 4 years goes by and we don't hear a peep about Rodney Alcala, right? I mean, we can only speculate about what's taking place during this time frame leading up to 1968. But we do know during 68 is when he commits his first horrific crime, or at least the first one we know of. So what was that crime? Well, he lured an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro into his vehicle by telling her that he knew her parents because she didn't want to get in initially. But once she did, he drove her to his Hollywood apartment. But thankfully, there was a good Samaritan that saw this entire interaction and decided to follow him. He felt like something wasn't right. They ended up calling the police. The police show up. Rodney Alcala books it out the back door. He's naked, by the way. The police, they find a little girl. She's beaten. She's sexually assaulted. She's pretty much left for dead. She was in a coma for weeks. He ends up evading arrest by moving to New York City and changing his name to John Berger. It's there he decides to enroll in NYU Film School. So this is a guy who's good at building new personas and who's constantly reinventing himself, right? He knows how to adapt to any situation. I'd say he's pretty organized, but I'll get into that later. Now we're going to jump 3 years to 1971, because this is around the time he decided to become a camp counselor and gain employment at Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. Now, coincidentally, while he was at Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, there was another serial killer who was also employed there. Now, his name was Richard Cottingham. They called him the Torso Killer. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that he and Alcala knew one another, but I mean, who knows, right? They could have been in the break room swapping stories next to the water cooler. Either way, I thought that was an interesting tidbit. Also, during his time in New York, he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. So his face was plastered everywhere. And by happenstance, a couple of the girls from the camp to which he was employed recognized him from a poster that was hanging up in the post office. They called the police. He was arrested. He was extradited back to California, found guilty for what he did to Talia Shapiro, and received a life sentence. So he gets sentenced to life in prison, but only served 34 months. Make that make sense to me. He kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and damn near murdered an 8-year-old girl, received a maximum sentence, and somehow he was released less than 3 years. This shit's fucking crazy. Now I know what you're thinking. There's no way he's going to do this again, right? There's no way he's going to put himself in that situation, because we all know sexual predators completely stop doing whatever their urges tell them to do. Yeah, no, less than 2 months later, he's arrested again for kidnapping a minor and selling her drugs. So he's found guilty again, this time for breaking his parole, kidnapping, possession of drugs, the minor. He gets his sentence, and guess what? He actually serves less than 34 months this time. He only served 2 years. He was paroled because they thought he was reformed. Rodney Alcala, reformed. And at this point, it's 1976. But the following year, in 1977, for some odd reason, his parole officer lets him move from California back to New York City. But he's not there very long. He arrived toward the end of summer, and then he departed New York and ended up back in California in September. But I want to tell you about something else that happened during the summer of 1977 in New York City. There was an aspiring model named Ellen Jane Hover. She went missing, and a couple weeks later, she was found dead. Now, in her appointment book, she was set to meet a professional photographer. And guess who that person's name was? That's right, John Berger. So no wonder he moved back to California so soon. He was evading police once again. Ironically, he was interviewed there by police officers who thought he might be the hillside strangler, but then he was ruled out. Little did they know who they were actually dealing with. Now, over a 12-month span, he murders 3 different women. 18-year-old Jill Barkham, 27-year-old Georgia Whitskirt, and 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb. But there may have been even more people. I mean, during this time, he was convincing men and women that he was a professional photographer, which made it easier for him to obtain his victims. This was his MO, which brings us to 1978, where we see him appear on a popular TV show, The Dating Game. Now, on this show, 3 eligible bachelors compete for a date with a bachelorette. Now, Alcala is introduced as a professional photographer, but the show did admit that they did not do a background check. I'd like to say it was surprising that he even won the date with the bachelorette, but I'm not surprised at all. Rodney Alcala was smart. He was charming. He was clever. He knew just what to say. He was socially competent. Not to mention, one of the answers that he gave to one of her questions, it completely won her over. It was fucking wild to me, but it won her over.
I am serving you for dinner.
Oh.
What are you called, and what do you look like?
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
Although, after talking with him off camera, she did realize that he was fucking creepy, and she didn't go on the date with him. Another crazy thing that happened on the show is that Rodney Alcala got into it with another bachelor. Now, according to that bachelor, Rodney Alcala screamed at him, "I always get the girl." And knowing what I do now, I believe he meant every word. And it's crazy because by the time he was on the show, he had already killed 5 women. So essentially, he's hiding in plain sight, which is fascinating because most serial killers try to avoid detection, right? Avoid publicity, avoid the spotlight. Yet here he is seeking it out. He wanted to be seen, which could stem around his abandonment issues. And I know the rejection from that bachelorette on the show did not help his psyche whatsoever. I mean, his next victim was the following year, 21-year-old Jill Parenta, July 14th, 1979. She was found dead in her Burbank apartment. But I can't even imagine the killing spree that he probably went on leading up to that because he was rejected. Now, his last victim was 12-year-old Robin Samso. She went missing on July 20th, 1979. She was riding a bike from her Huntington Beach home to her ballet class. And she was found 12 days later, beaten, sexually assaulted, and stabbed. I mean, this guy enjoyed inflicting pain. He was a sexually motivated sadomasochist. Now, he became a suspect when police spoke to her friends. Her friends told police that there was a strange man who approached them on the beach wanting to take their pictures. There was a sketch drawn. It was circulated throughout the public. Thankfully, his parole officer saw the photo, notified police, and said, "Hey, you might want to look into this guy." At this point, it's July 24th, 1979. There was a search warrant. He's living at his parents' place. They searched the home, found a receipt for a storage locker in the Seattle area. There they found, trophies. of his victims, and he was arrested on that date. They also found thousands of pictures as well, pictures of men and women, young boys and young girls, along with jewelry from his victims. I mean, these things allowed him to relive those moments, over and over again. It was gratifying for him. And it's sad to think about, a lot of these victims, a lot of these people in these photos, they went missing and they were never found. They weren't even ID'd. Now, his court proceedings were interesting. A few months later, he was found guilty and sentenced to death in 1980 for the murder of Robin Samso. But 4 years later, that gets overturned, his sentence, due to improper evidence. Now, he's on remand for another couple of years, so he's still being held until his second trial in 1986. Yet again, he's found guilty and sentenced to death for the murder of Robin Samso. But that sentencing also gets overturned 15 years later in April of 2001. Apparently, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals thought the defense didn't provide Rodney Alcala with adequate protection. I mean, his case should have been open and shut back in 1980. I don't know what the fuck was going on, but hats off to the justice system at that point. Again, he's on remand, but he's still being held. But he's fucked this time around thanks to how far we've come with technology. So thanks to DNA testing and revisiting crime scene reports, post-mortem reports, they were able to identify DNA found on his victims and connect him to the murders of these 4 women: Jill Barkham, Georgia Whitskirt, Charlotte Lamb, and Cornelia Criley. And Cornelia Criley was actually his first documented murder back in 1971 in New York City. Her case went unsolved until 2011. Now, in January of 2010, there's another trial, and he chose to be his own attorney because no one can represent Rodney Alcala like he can, because he loved the spotlight. He wanted to be the center of attention. It spoke to his arrogance, his hubris. And in a way, he gets to relive his crimes, and it's disgusting, especially, during the cross-examination of Robin Samso's mother. So he definitely knew what he was doing and he was enjoying it. But he had no defense, especially when it came to his DNA that was found on the 4 women that he murdered. Ultimately, in February of 2010, he was found guilty for their deaths and the murder of Robin Samso, and he was sentenced to death once again for a 3rd time. But he did end up dying in prison, although it was for natural causes. It was on July 24th, 2021. Coincidentally, July 24th was the same date that he was apprehended. Rodney Alcala was an organized serial killer. He had above average IQ. I believe it was around 135, which is damn near genius level. He was socially competent, sexually competent. He was a planner. He knew just what to do and just what to say to get people to do what he wanted. He even possessed a controlled mood during his offenses. It was noted that he played with his victims. He toyed with them. He would strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, then wait until they were revived, and then repeat the act all over again. It was all about control for him. One could surmise that he even followed the news as well. I mean, he would pose his victims differently to try to throw off the police so they wouldn't find a pattern. Now, I'm not an expert, but Rodney Alcala was a textbook organized serial killer. He was sexually motivated. He was sadomasochistic. He was a predator. He was a monster. And thankfully, he was caught. Now, on my next episode, I'll talk about a disorganized killer and how that person differs from an organized one. But I thank you guys for tuning in. I do ask that you smash that like button, subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know what you think. Share this video out there, hit that bell for notifications, and you guys take care.